the long-awaited recommendations, is the Labour body happy with the outcome?
No, we're not happy. It is a very strange report in that it comes up with all sorts of very good arguments for getting rid of Etolls. As your bulletin said, it places a disproportionate burden on the poor. It's very, very difficult to collect. It's extremely unpopular. All which would reinforce the argument for saying, well, let's get rid of Etolls, but then shies away and says, well, no, we'll keep them at least for the moment, and then have another meeting in February. And we hope that that meeting will finally make the government see sense and see that this is completely unworkable. But from our point of view, it's also completely unacceptable. That's why we're not interested in small changes to the amount of the tolls here and there. We object in principle to what we regard as the commodification of what ought to be a basic public service, paid for by society as a whole through taxation on a progressive basis. And we reject this idea of user pays, which is an extremely reactionary idea, that you only pay for social services if you actually use them. Roads are there for everybody.
Mr. Craven, look, Outer says that this report is quite confusing. Do you also get the same sense?
Yeah, absolutely. As I say, it produces all sorts of good arguments for getting rid of tolls, and then says, but nevertheless, we'll stick with them for the moment. They clearly are not enthusiastic about the tolls, but just don't seem to have looked at any alternative, which surely was one of the main tasks which they were given.
And speaking of the alternatives there, Mr. Craven, if the fuel levy is indeed the viable option now, what impact would it have on both the workers and the motorists, and of course the low and middle income earners in this country?
Well, the fuel levy isn't, in our view, the best solution, because it has some of the same problems as Etolls, although of course it has the huge advantage that it's far more efficient, because it costs virtually nothing to collect. Our argument has been that it should be general taxation, which is progressive. The more you earn, the more you pay. And that's the way we fund most basic services, education, health, and so on. And we regard the roads as being part of that. Of course, we want fewer people to use their cars on the roads, but you can't do that until you've also used public money to provide a far better, more reliable, safer, and affordable public transport system, which is the way most other cities in the world are going. So you reach a stage where nobody wants to use their car on the highway, because it would be far quicker to jump onto a train or a bus.
Mr. Craven, but wouldn't that general taxation put a strain already on these low-income groups that we've mentioned? How would it work out?
No, the advantage of general taxation is that the lower your income, the less you pay. And if you're very poor, you don't probably pay any at all, except, of course, for VAT, which nobody can avoid. But that's not to say the taxation system is perfect, but it's the best way we have for funding things which should be generally available to the public as a whole, and not regarded as a commodity which you can buy if you can afford it.
Mr. Craven, a final decision will only be made after the meeting between Gauteng and, of course, the national government. What are your expectations from that? Outer was very hopeful. We had them in studio earlier on.
Well, yes, I'm hopeful as well. As long as it is a genuinely representative meeting, I'm absolutely confident that the majority of people at that meeting will say, no, we don't want Etolls at all. Even if there are little changes here and there, we reject it in principle and are going to continue our fight until it finally collapses, which we believe it will anyway.
Thank you so much, Mr. Craven, for your time right here on PM News. Well, that's Mr. Patrick Craven, Cosatu's spokesperson on the subject of the recommendations of the Etolls review panel.